The Oneida made their mark when they became America's first ally during the American Revolution. But their victory wasn't a win after all. It was actually the beginning of a nightmare, one that involved the worst betrayal in history. We'll get more into that later on. For centuries, the Oneida lived a self-sustaining lifestyle, living and thriving peacefully off the land. The name Oneida means people of the standing stone, and it's based on an intriguing ancient legend. According to the legend, the Oneida people were being pursued on foot by an enemy tribe. As their enemies chased them into a clearing within the woodlands, they suddenly disappeared, leaving the enemy confused as to where they could have gone. It was then believed that they had shapeshifted into the stones that stood in the clearing. As a result, they became known as the people of the standing stone. While their name as a whole has a few different origins, individuals are also given carefully selected names. Those born into the Oneida Nation are identified according to their spirit name, their clan, and their family unit within a clan. They identify with three main clans: the wolf, the turtle, and the bear. Each clan has a significant origin experience that underlines their responsibility. The wolf clan is said to be the pathfinders, giving people direction in life. The turtle clan's responsibility is to look after the environment, and the bear clan became known as the medicine people. You might be surprised to know that the Oneida have a matrilineal kinship system, meaning that children are considered to be born into their mother's clan, through which descent and inheritance passes. Members of each clan are considered relatives. So two members of the bear clan would be considered brother and sister and would not be allowed to marry. Even though they might not be blood related, they are clan related. And because of the matrilineal kinship, women are highly regarded. Clan mothers are responsible for choosing quality leaders and making decisions for the family, for the clan, and for the nation. A clan mother has a responsibility to everyone that is in the same family line. They also settle arguments, ensure families are conducting their lives in the proper manner, and name all of the newborns in the clan. The chiefs are also chosen by the clan mothers. They're chosen according to their ability to make choices for the people on the issues that have been discussed. They're responsible for making choices and decisions that are in the best interests of the families within the clan. Future generations are highly considered when making major decisions. Faith keepers are responsible for ensuring ceremonies and rituals are being held when they should be, specifically when the seasons change. They have similar duties as a clan mother as counselors to help mend disagreements that come about within the families, including counseling married couples. Clothing carries great meaning in the Oneida culture, as it is seen as a physical representation of who they are. Before coming into contact with the Europeans, the Oneida tribe would use only natural materials to make their clothing, like animal hides and tree bark. Some Oneida wore nothing but handmade moccasins on their feet. But when the Europeans arrived, new material became more available, since they brought their trade business with them. The Oneidas started trading for newer materials, and their clothing began to include calico cotton and broadcloth. Back in the early 17th century, the tribe occupied and maintained roughly 6 million acres of land in what is modern-day central New York State. But after the Europeans arrived, their boundaries drastically changed. The Oneida Indian Nation existed as a sovereign government with recognized borders long before the English colonies or the United States were formed. Things went reasonably well at first. In 1613, the Oneida and other members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy reached an agreement on a treaty with the newcomers, and it was recorded with a 2-row wampum belt. The belt depicts 2 paths, one for the Oneida and their Haudenosaunee brothers, and the other for the Europeans. This was the first formal recognition by non-Indians that the people who already occupied North America were independent nations that possessed territorial rights when the Europeans started to share their land. At this point, everyone had what they wanted, and they lived peacefully, for now. The Oneida managed to thrive on their lands for over a century before the government got involved again. In 1763, the British Crown created a policy that gave the king power to engage in land transactions with Indian nations, which basically recognized the Oneida Territory as a self-governing nation, and the Crown's desire for formal government-to-government relations. Luckily, everyone was still in agreement, and there was no threat to the Six Nations lands yet. Then in 1775, the American Revolution, also called the US War of Independence, started, and America had to fight to gain independence from the British Empire. During this war, 13 of Great Britain's North American colonies threw off British rule to create their own country, the United States of America. The Oneida, as well as the other 5 tribes of the Six Nations Iroquois Confederacy, originally took a neutral stance in the American Revolution. This was because a neutral position gave the Confederacy leverage against both sides, since they could easily threaten to join one side or the other. But this plan quickly backfired. Eventually, the majority of the Six Nations Confederacy did choose a side: the Loyalists, aka the British, which basically split the Oneida from the Confederacy. For some time, the Oneida and the Tuscarora tribe were the only ones left maintaining a neutral position, and they continued to advocate for it, and even tried to convince the other tribes to join them. But ultimately, they were faced with an impossible decision. The Oneida realized that it was time to choose a side. Because of their proximity and relations with the rebel communities, most Oneida favored the revolutionaries. It also helped that they were heavily influenced by a close colonist friend, Samuel Kirkland, an American-born Presbyterian missionary who worked amongst the Oneida tribe for many years before the American Revolution. A number of the tribe were baptized as Christians in the decade prior to the war. The Oneida had a strong relationship with Kirkland, and they trusted him. So they officially joined the rebel side, fighting for independence from British rule, and they contributed in many ways to the war. Their warriors were often used as scouts on offensive campaigns and to assess enemy operations. They also provided an open line of communication between the rebels and their Iroquois rivals, as they understood the languages and culture. Due to old alliances and a belief that they stood a better chance of keeping their lands under British rule, the majority of the Iroquois nation supported the British in some form or another. Only the Oneida and the Tuscarora gave their major support to the colonists, and this undoubtedly caused a lot of tension among the indigenous groups. The Confederacy members who supported the British helped their allies launch numerous devastating raids, including attacks on the Oneida. The rival tribes often raided and destroyed each other's villages. It was complete chaos. Nations were fighting nations, and individuals within each nation took different sides. Things quickly turned into an absolute mess, and a real disheartening one. In 1777, between 60 to 100 Oneida warriors fought alongside the colonial militia in the Battle of Oriskany. It was one of the few battles of the war where most non-Indigenous participants were settlers born in the 13 colonies. The colonists suffered heavy casualties during the battle, and so did the Oneida. This battle is significant because it essentially marked the beginning of a civil war among the Iroquois nations, solidifying their opposing stances in the American Revolution. The Bloody Battle's location is known as a place of great sadness, and it's since been designated as a National Historic Landmark. The Oneidas' contribution to the revolution cannot be understated. The tribe brought bushels of maize to General George Washington's starving Patriot Army, who otherwise would have likely perished. During this time, many Oneidas formed friendships with prominent rebel leaders, including George Washington himself. One Oneida woman, Polly Cooper, showed Washington's people how to properly store, cook, and eat the corn. Washington even tried to give her cash as compensation, but she actually refused, saying that it was her duty to serve. Though to be clear, it was not all sunshine and rainbows. Things eventually started to fall apart, and the Oneida were yet to suffer the biggest loss of all. While the Oneida had once been a strong support for the colonists, their nation was slowly falling into ruin. Even though the chiefs had chosen to side with the colonists, individuals within the tribe had started to make their own decisions, and it didn't look good. As the war progressed and the Oneida's position became more dire, a minority group of the Oneida people became skeptical of the side that they were on. This minority started to grow, and when an important settlement to the tribe was destroyed, a large group of the Oneidas defected from the rebellion and ended up joining the British. Now divided, the tribe was smaller and weaker than ever before, but they still didn't give up. In July of 1776, the Revolutionary War officially ended the British rule over the colonies, establishing their independence as the United States of America. The Declaration of Independence embodied the political philosophies of liberalism and republicanism, rejected monarchy and aristocracy, and famously proclaimed that all men are created equal. While the colonists had gained control over 13 colonies on American soil, the Oneida were displaced. Their villages were continually raided by lingering British settlers who were looking for retaliation, and who could not tell the difference between their Iroquois allies or foes. Many of the Six Nations were forced from their land and became homeless and hungry. Then things got worse. After the war, the Oneida had hoped to return to their homelands and finally start rebuilding their villages and their lives. But the colonists, now the Americans, believed that they had actually won the land in the conflict, and it no longer belonged to the people of the Six Nations. So now a whole lot of indigenous people went from simply being houseless to landless. They literally had nowhere to go, and this did not sit well. Not only that, there were still people in the US who sided with the British, including many indigenous peoples. They believed that if the British had won the war, then they would have all their land back, and this wouldn't be a problem. Instead, they were now kicked off their land and left to fend for themselves. This drastically changed the way the Oneida felt about their American allies. Now the US had a new enemy. In an attempt to make peace, a series of treaties were formed, but they didn't do what they had hoped. The US government created several peace treaties in an attempt to make up for the trouble that the war caused. But these so-called treaties also involved the Six Nations giving up even more land in Ohio, and they didn't like that. The Six Nations refused to agree to any of these treaties presented by the US government, which only increased tensions between them. The government was simply not being fair, and the Six Nations held strong. And their perseverance ended up paying off, for one good reason. You see, the US was terrified that the Oneida were going to join the oppositional forces who were still lingering around the western frontier. They now realized that the indigenous nations were not about to give up their fight for the land that they so very much deserved. And if they didn't give them what they wanted, they were risking even bigger problems. This is when the government formed a new, much more fair treaty. The Treaty of Canandaigua. Discussions were tense at first, but it was actually the indigenous chiefs who were able to maintain professionalism, reminding government officials that peace was the real goal. After much discussion, 59 chiefs signed the treaty that established peace and friendship between the United States of America and the Six Nations. It granted them 6 million acres of land, effectively becoming the first Native American reservation in the United States. It also affirmed land rights, defined boundaries, and promised monetary compensation. But while all of this sounds great, let's be real, we know that it didn't last. While the US government did manage to honor the monetary payouts, something they did not honor was the land rights, not surprisingly. Here's where the betrayal comes in. The treaty had promised to protect tribal land rights against state interference. But by the early 19th century, the state of New York was purchasing treaty lands and forcing the removal of the Oneida, displacing them once more, and forcing many to flee north to Canada. So even though they had actually helped the US government fight off the British and effectively take over the land, the government didn't return any favors. Instead, they basically took their land as a win and found small ways to slowly draw out the Six Nations populations over the next several years. Eventually, they had almost nothing left. By 1920, the Oneida Nation had only 32 acres left, down from the 6 million they held before the American Revolution. And while several chiefs had fought tirelessly over the decades, one Oneida woman by the name of Mary Winder felt empowered to continue the fight. Mary wrote the Federal Indian Bureau in 1920, asking how much money was owed to the nation for the loss of its homeland. Of course, she got no response. She was basically ghosted. But even so, she continued to write to them for decades, requesting that they live up to treaty guarantees to preserve the Oneidas' homeland. And 26 years after her first letter, her efforts were finally noticed. In 1946, the Commission was allowed to award monetary damages in cases where the US government did not live up to its responsibilities. But it couldn't actually restore any land to them. Money was not what they wanted, though. They simply wanted their land back. And then a horrific tragedy occurred, forcing immediate action. In 1976, a fire broke out in a trailer home owned by family members of Mary Winder. But the local fire department refused to respond to their calls for help because of territory boundaries. As a result, 2 people ended up perishing in the fire. It was this horrible event that then became the catalyst for the Oneida Nation to stand up tall and once again become self-sufficient and rebuild their community. After several more years of back and forth court proceedings, in 1987, the Oneida Nation was finally awarded 42 acres of land back. And while it was still a far cry from the 6 million that they used to have, it was a huge victory for the people. Even still, they did not give up and the lawsuit continued on. Today, the Oneida Indian Nation has regained more than 18,000 acres of their original homelands, the most they have had recognized sovereignty over since 1824. It's been a slow and steady climb, but their perseverance has led to a resurgence of the Oneida Indian Nation that now prospers. So not only did they make it out on top, they managed to remain generous, peaceful, and forgiving the entire time. That wraps up this journey. Thanks for watching Splash Travels. Like and subscribe to uncover more of the world's best kept secrets. And don't forget to dive into even more fascinating facts on our main page, Factinate.